Okay, so for our final session, we probably have the most exciting part because this is going to be real life people that have actually done this. And for today's panel, we have Adam Rupp, Chris Fredericks, and Olson. So Adam Rupp is the CFO of Midwest Mole, which transitioned to an ESOP in February of 2020. So he's kind of the new kid on the block who's just dabbled his feet in it and getting wet, right? So trying to figure out what the heck is going on. And then we have Chris Fredericks, who's the president and CEO of TVF, True Value Fabrics, and Empowered Ventures. And TVF transitioned to an ESOP in 2010. So he's kind of the old man in the ESOP world. And most recently founded Empowered Ventures as a way to grow value of the ESOP through acquisitions. And then on the co-op side, we have Ole Olson, who has worked for cooperatives for over 40 years, including the past 30 years as a member owner of Isthmus Engineering and Manufacturing Cooperative. Ole has served several terms as board member for the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives and is a founding member and current president of the Madison Worker Cooperatives. And again, for members of the audience, if you'd please submit your questions to the panel via chat, we'll communicate the questions to the panelists and get your response. And then for the panelists, if you could please share with our audience about your company and journey to employee ownership, and then we'll open the panel up to questions from our audience. So Adam, would you like to lead off? Oh, you're on mute. We're not hearing you.
Oh, no, can you guys hear me now?
Spot on.
Okay, sorry about that. Sure, I've got a couple slides if that's cool. Do you care if I share my screen real quick? Can you guys see my screen at all?
Yep.
Yep.
Good deal. So I'll go through these just real quick, but we are Midwest Mole. We are a specialty underground contractor, primarily focusing in trenchless utility installation. And the way we do that is typically by boring, tunneling, and directional drill. We also, believe it or not, still hand mining is still a thing where if the ground conditions are too unpredictable or too difficult, we still do have guys at the front of the face of a tunnel mining it by hand and installing it that way, which is pretty incredible. That's still a thing. We're primarily in the sanitation, water, so water and sewer. We also do a lot for railroads, airports, other utilities like electric, conduit, that type of thing. And we do operate primarily in the Midwest, and we also have a presence on the East Coast, but we will travel wherever the job makes sense. Aside from kind of the West Coast states like California, Oregon, Washington, those are typically a difficult sell for us. We were founded in 1982 by Len Liotti, so we are celebrating our 40th year in business, which is fantastic. I started with 15 employees with only 2 field crews. Then Dan Liotti, the owner who sold to the ESOP, eventually joined in 1985. And then Dan retired in 2020, which is when we became an ESOP. And right now we have 25 office and 19 shop and trucking employees. So we have about 45-ish folks in the ESOP program right now. Our field force is union, and therefore we chose to exclude our union folks because they are already collectively bargained. So that's a bit of a variation from other folks who might have ESOP experience. It's a little difficult sometimes to sing the praises of the ESOP to one group and then have other folks who are doing the field work be excluded. So that has been its own unique challenge. And like I said earlier, we have 2 locations in Greenfield and 1 office in Alexandria, Virginia, which is right outside of DC, which really helps with our presence for federal projects and things like that.
Excellent. Thanks, Adam. If Chris, can you please provide a brief overview of your company or companies?
Yeah, thanks, Rick. Appreciate you having me. So I don't have any fancy slides like Adam, sorry. But if you need information about us, definitely reach out to Rick and we can get you some information. So I run 2 companies, TVF, which stands for Top Value Fabrics. That was the original company that became an ESOP in 2010. And the way that happened is kind of a classic story. The founder of the business had gotten to a point where he decided to transition ownership of the company, and really didn't feel like he had any great options. He wasn't willing to sell to competition or to private equity. He had concerns about going those routes. He'd also had a couple of failed management buyout attempts. So he was pretty gun shy about, what his next move would be. I was CFO at the time, and he asked me to help him figure out what his best option would be at this point. And he actually ended up having health issues as well that precipitated the need to sell the company relatively urgently. So I was approached by our accounting firm, Katzepper Miller, which is a local firm here in Indy, that's also an employee-owned firm. And they actually advised me about how ESOPs work, and that they thought it would be a good option to consider. So I recommended to the founder that he consider that, and we ended up going down like a very traditional kind of best practices ESOP transaction approach. We started with a feasibility study, received a lot of great advice from local advisors, partnered with a few local advisors on the different aspects of the transaction. And then, pretty much in short order, we were able to execute a 100% ESOP transaction within about 6 months from, start to finish. And we weren't really in a huge hurry to rush it. So the founder was very pleased with the outcome ultimately. And with that, I ended up taking over leadership of the company. Fast forward now 12 years later, it's gone extremely well. Our employee owners love it. We did a lot of things well. I think there was a lot of things to learn as well, mistakes we made along the way. And now we have formed a holding company called Empowered Ventures to kind of continue our growth path and continue to create value for our employee owners. And that holding company is Empowered Ventures, and we're basically seeking to diversify through acquisition while also growing value for everyone. So that's our brief story.
Thanks, Chris. Over to Ole.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me, and thank you for doing this. So I want to point out right up front that we're a worker co-op, not an ESOP. Still employee owned, so a lot of similarities, but a few differences also. We build custom automation equipment for several different industries, including medical, consumer products, automotive, and light industrial. So we build machines to make things, basically. We're located in Madison, Wisconsin. It was originally formed as a partnership in 1980. At that time, they were designers, and they weren't assuming any risk. They started to build things in the first couple of years, and that they took on liability, they took on risk, and they needed to incorporate to mitigate some of that risk. So they started looking for a way to incorporate that would be fair to everybody. And I'll get into that in a second. And they came up with a worker cooperative model. They officially became a worker co-op January 1st, 1983. So it's a mixture of engineers, machinists, electricians, mechanics, and administrators. We have just over 85 employees now. Over half are member owners of the company. There's a 2-year probation before you can have the option to apply for membership. We do about, close to 40 million a year in sales. And why did we convert to a worker co-op from a partnership? I guess in one word, ironically, nepotism. The 4 original founders worked for a private individual, and they had a gentleman's agreement that they were doing all the sales, all the engineering, all the grunt work, basically. And they had a gentleman's agreement that at some point they would take over the business. And one day the owner walked in with his son, who they'd never met before, and he said, "Hi, this is Sam. He's taking over the business." And they were all kind of shocked, and they kind of got swept under the rug. So they decided to do their own thing. They could do it themselves. So they left and they became a worker co-op. Part of the inspiration to become a worker co-op was because of an old video called the Mondragon experiment.
Oh, yeah.
there's a lot of worker co-ops in the US, and they're all somewhat modeled after the Mondragon cooperatives. So ironically, 30 years later, in 2010, two of the original founders toured Mondragon in Spain. And one of the questions that they asked when they got there was, what do you do about nepotism? What do you do about hiring family? And they looked at them quizzically and said, what are you talking about? What do you think we're building all this for? We're building it for our family. So twist of fate on nepotism. Anyway, so the it's been a worker co-op fully since 1983. We continue to have pretty much a linear upward growth. And we've been very busy and continue to stay very busy. So I'll let it move on to questions from here.
Great. Thank you very much for that insightful discussion on kind of the evolutionary process of the company. The first question we have from the audience, and Ole might have already responded to this, but we'll go Adam, Chris, and Ole in that order, if that's okay. Are there any circumstances other than interest in employee worker ownership that precipitated the direction your company took?
That's a really good question. For us, and I think Chris may have touched on a little bit of this as well, but we're a specialty contractor, which is a pretty difficult business to exit, frankly. When you think of the traditional ways to exit a business, when Dan owned the company, he could have sold to a private equity type or a private wealth group. He could have sold to a competitor. With the competitor option, there's the risk that you lose some people with synergies and things like that, and you lose a lot of the culture that he and his father the last 40 years. And the private equity model is very difficult for contractors that do bid work. That's almost primarily where all of our revenue comes from, is new bids. They like to see that annual recurring revenue model, kind of a stable EBITDA. That doesn't really exist for specialty contracting. We only eat what we kill every year is kind of how I like to phrase it. So I don't want to make it seem like ESOPs were the last option, but those are kind of the traditional models. And then when Dan was advised, actually, I believe it was by KSM as well, about ESOPs, he just thought that was the perfect fit. It retains the company culture. It allows him to kind of have that lasting legacy, carry on the company name, and he's not selling to a competitor that might shut the doors and let a lot of people go. So I think those were the primary drivers behind the reason that Dan sold to an ESOP instead of another model.
Thanks, Adam.
Yeah, and for me, for TVF, again, back in 2010, the founder, Dick Hansel, I wouldn't say that employee ownership was even in the top 3 or 4 for him as an individual in the reason that we sold to the ESOP, which for me, it was as a recommender of this, solution. For Dick, it was a little bit more about the combination of comfort level with kind of knowing the way the company would continue to be run by the current leadership team. His ability to kind of stay involved as a board member. He provided a seller note for the transaction, so he wanted to stay involved to some degree while that seller note was paid off. And then, as I mentioned too, another factor would have been his concern about losing control to a third party like private equity or a strategic. And then finally, being 100% S Corp ESOP, there's a significant cash flow advantage due to the tax deferral. So that was a significant factor that made the transaction quite favorable and made it a really easy process. So Dick was supportive of the employee ownership approach. It was really me and the rest of the leadership team that were super excited about it from a culture and long-term perspective, for the business.
Thanks, Chris. Ole?
Well, I think I answered it a little bit to start with the nepotism comment, but really they were seeking, our founders were seeking a way to be fair to everyone and to make sure everybody was represented. To this day, we're going to break a lot of rules that you've talked about earlier today. To this day, every member, every owner sits on the board of directors. We have over 42 people on our board of directors. But it works. It's taken us a long time to get to a point where we will works. And we know that it someday we'll probably have to move to a representative board if we continue to grow. But our board meetings right now with 42 people range from an hour to 2 hours. When we first started, it wasn't unusual for our board meetings to be 5 or 6 hours long. So the model that they set up originally of being fair to everybody continues to play out. So.
Awesome. Thank you very much. The next question from the audience is, what has been the most significant change in the company since becoming employee owned? Adam?
For us, and I apologize, I was only able to jump on right before this panel started, so you may have discussed a lot of the board dynamics previously. But for us, I would say it's two things. One is there's this tremendous employee ownership mentality that has kind of permeated the business, and it didn't happen overnight. It took a while. We're two and a half years into this now, and it took a while to understand what an ESOP truly was. And now that they've seen a couple rounds of participant statements, they're seeing the value that they can drive for the organization. So that's definitely one. And each decision when I say employee ownership mentality, they're understanding that how each decision they make can help generate more profitability and therefore a higher participant value for them each year when they see those statements. And the second, and probably the biggest change, was just the change from that private owned company mentality to, Dan Liotti sits in the head honcho seat, right? So all decisions ultimately stopped with him. If there was a disagreement on a piece of equipment to buy, a job to bid on, things like that, the buck stopped with him. And that is a little bit different now. The main day-to-day management of the company is still run by our executive team and our management team, but we do have this board of directors now. Two are, I would say, internal. So Dan remains on the board of directors. Our current company president is on the board of directors. And then it's 3 external folks. And they are a tremendous resource, but I'd be lying if I didn't say there were some stumbling blocks right out of the gate with that board dynamic. Nobody knew exactly how to interact, what decisions were board level, what decisions were day-to-day management. So any mistakes or hiccups or things like that, I can promise you we've made them or will make them through this process. So sometimes ESOPs they're kind of this big, complicated, hairy thing, but it is, I promise you that if we can work it, you all can. But that, to answer your question, that board dynamic is definitely a new thing that we continue to learn.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam. Over to you, Chris.
I would echo a lot of what Adam said. Culture has been the biggest change by a long shot, and very similar experience. The early years, the change was on the slower side. Everyone was excited about it, but also trepidatious, a little bit uncertain about what this really meant for the long term. And then after a few years and a few share statements going out, and them seeing the value in real life, meaningful value, the message we were sending and the culture, it started to take hold. And now here, 12 years later, it's a complete overhaul of the culture, from when we took it over back in 2010. In addition to that, which has been incredibly exciting, I would say the other way the company's most different is a longer term view on investments and hiring. So previously, the owner was much more focused on annual, cash flow and maximizing that, and really not thinking truly long term, multiple decades out in terms of how we're going about building the leadership team, the long-term strategy for the business. So over the last more so 5 to 6 years, I think we have shifted that mindset as well. We've started to build a layer into our leadership team to kind of move everyone up in responsibility level, and also do a lot more consistent job thinking long-term with our strategy and our decisions, which also led to the holding company approach and making acquisitions. So that's been a fun shift for me to kind of get out of the day-to-day business and hire people who are great at that, and really start to think longer term and think about how we really make significant additional value contributions to everybody's ESOP accounts. So that's been the other big change.
Always exciting. Ole?
For us, initially, it was figuring out how to be run a business with a direct democracy. At the time, there were very few worker co-ops, or even there weren't that many ESOPs around either, but there was nobody that set an example for us. We're basing a lot of the company off of that old grainy video I told you about. And so figuring out a way, it started as an experiment. They said, well, let's try it this way, and we'll see if we can make it work. And to this day, we still kind of consider it an experiment. I don't think we've made a change to our bylaws in a decade, probably. Initially, there was a few changes every year to the bylaws, but we've kind of worked through that. And I think, as Adam said it, if we can do it, anybody can do it, I think. But it definitely, the employee ownership culture permeates the company and continues to do it to this day. When we hire a new engineer or a new machinist, very few of them even know what a co-op is. They don't understand employee ownership. So we have to bring them on board and expose them to our culture. And that's one of the reasons we have a 2-year probationary period, is to see how people fit in. And it's amazing how some people blossom when they become a member. Yeah, occasionally it doesn't work, but not very often. Most people really take on responsibility and start looking for the good of the company, rather than just looking for themselves as an individual. So that was the biggest change, I think, was just the employee ownership culture that had to be generated.
And I have a follow-up question, and we'll go reverse order this time. So Ole, you talked a little bit about recruiting, and one of the questions that has come in is, have you seen changes with your recruiting and the difference between simply hiring an employee to hiring a partner or a co-owner?
Definitely. It's really hard to do for us, when we're interviewing people, you're one-on-one for a half an hour. You might have multiple interviews, but it's really hard. We're essentially going into business potentially with each person that we bring in. And that's always in the back of our minds, but it's not something that you can necessarily eliminate candidates on. It's amazing. People aren't always what they seem. It's a little bit different example, but we had a machinist, this is 30 years ago, that one of the owners at the time didn't want him to become a member. He was an employee just starting out. And there was one member that was kind of trying to hold him back. Well, this person applied for membership, went through the process. He did get voted in. And a few years later, he became the president of our board. He was voted as the president. To this day, he's one of the best presidents we've ever had. And it kind of blows people away. He was a machinist. How did he have the temperament and the background or the knowledge to be president? And you just don't know coming from an interview. So it's an example I still like to use.
Chris?
Yeah, in our early years, I would say it didn't have much of an impact, and I blame ourselves for that. We didn't do a great job speaking publicly about the employee ownership portion of the business and the excitement and benefits of it. And in fact, this was one of the mistakes I think that we learned was we had quite a few people internally who were actually fearful of being too public about the fact that we became employee owned. There was a false sense of that it would come across like we're not like a large corporation, or a trusted family owned business or something. There was a few people in the business that had this feeling, so we didn't, and including a marketing person. So we didn't aggressively, change our stance and approach with hiring or on our website or in our marketing. And I think, we, not too long, like maybe 4 or 5 years in, we changed our stance on that. We started to embrace it publicly, proudly. And of course, our customers loved it. The fears were completely unfounded. And then, over the last 5 years, I would say hiring has been significantly improved because of our approach to sharing, the benefits of both employee ownership, but also the culture that it's helped us create. I think we've gotten especially much better at that the last few years, at communicating what it's like to work inside the business, as well as the financial benefits of employee ownership. And in fact, some of our newer companies, which I heard Chris Cooper speaking about, a machine shop that had this benefit as well. One of our newer companies is also a machine shop, and they've hired, they increased their team by 20% in 12 months. And the employee ownership piece of it was huge for them, to go out and have that as a tool to explain, what it will be like to be part of that company. And all those folks have stuck. So I would say that the benefits have been really, really strong and clear for us, but it was a big learning process to learn how to make it clear, because we definitely learned that just saying we're an employee owned company or we're an ESOP by itself, just in the small paragraph at the bottom of a hiring ad or something, that doesn't make any difference at all. There's an element of needing to go above and beyond, permeating all the communications and marketing, and having the culture really be felt out in everything that's being communicated. That I think has been key to making the employee ownership component palpable to candidates who are exploring, whether they'd want to join up with us.
Yeah, I often wonder sometimes if it's, because a lot of times at my company, we would do like panel discussions or panel interviews. And, part of that discussion is like, well, we're an ESOP now, we're employee owned. And yeah, you're looking to hire an employee, but really, like Ole said, we're going to go in business with this person and you're hiring a business partner. It's not a question of, do you want this guy to work for you? It's a question of, do you want to go into business with this partner? And man, once we did that, it was a step change in, that thought process in terms of the recruiting and the hiring process. And it's always interesting to just think about that again, we're a family, we're a partnership, it's employee ownership, and all of those guys are there to really help us out. So Adam, over to you. What have you guys found in terms of recruiting and that methodology?
So we're still in the early stages of the ESOP, obviously, and therefore of marketing it as well. And I'll be very, very transparent. The thing that's our stumbling block to do, I would love to do kind of what Chris alluded to, be much better at broadcasting this, kind of helping show what employee ownership means to us as a company. I don't even think we have it listed on our website. And I think the primary driver of that is that our union folks are excluded from the plan. And that is a significant challenge. One, again, transparently, we probably would undo if we could go back and do it again, and just include everyone, because it takes away partially from just from the idea of an ESOP and all being in this together and all being employee owners, to have one set of our producers not really in the plan. So, but with that said, when it comes to hiring for our office and shop positions, at first we stumbled a little bit about how to, we said we're an employee owned company. It's a great place to work for. And they'd say, okay, what does that mean? And we'd say, I don't know. It's you get shares each year, and it's really cool. So we've refined that message a little bit to be just communicate that better. And one thing that we have realized, the ESOP cannot take place of things like cash bonuses and things like that, because to a 25-year-old engineer that you're trying to hire, it's great. If you can keep them on for 5 or 6 years and show what that statement can build up to, they can see that there's real value there when they go to retire. But if you don't have kind of a cash now component of your compensation plan, that the ESOP carrot is on a very, very long stick for people early in their careers. And even though it is a great retention tool, you do need to keep those folks long enough to kind of have them see the value that they're generating through the ESOP. So that once we kind of have figured those things out, it's become a great recruiting tool. And it's part of our benefits package that we show folks when we're going through the interview process. And we try to get folks to understand, kind of like you said, Rick, that they're owners, right? They're on the team, but you're joining the team as an owner. So when you join as an owner and get that mindset set very, very early.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the challenges is, hey, 45 years from now, you're going to have this golden nest egg, right? And it's like, okay, but I've got I've got a wife, I've got a house, I've got a car, I've got kids, I've got college. Can you help me with that? And it's like, well, maybe not, So I think one of the challenges, in an ESOP is to be able, and yeah, it's retirement. Yeah, it's managed under ERISA. Yeah, it's regulated by DOL. But as long as you're here and as long as you're getting those shares, it's portable. So if you do have to leave or if you do transition out at some point in time, that money goes with you. So it's not just a question of it's 40 years in the future or nothing, but obviously we'd want them to stay. So it's like a two-edged sword, right? So
exactly.
One of the challenges is, in a regular company, the workers work and the managers manage, and they do what I say, and life is easy. It's simple. There's not a lot of brain thought going on. I tell you what to do and you do it. But in an ESOP, right, we're kind of expecting, managers to listen and employees to contribute. But how do you make that transition between, do what I tell you to do and, hey, we're going to do this. What do you think is a better way to do it, to be able to gain that engagement and from the employee? So that's the magical question. If we can solve that one, then we can all go off and be rich somewhere. So, Ole, you guys, you're the 30-year guys that have been doing this for the longest time. So how have you guys managed that process?
Well, first of all, I have to point out that we are very limited on managers. We do everything we can. We have kind of a flat management system. We do a lot of our management through committees. We do have a sales manager and an operations manager. Sales manager is basically responsible for obviously everything that happens outside the business, bringing new customers in. Operations manager is responsible for setting up schedules and helping to figure out how we're going to get things done inside the building. But other than that, we have no shop managers. We have no engineering manager. We have all that's done with committees that the board has put together. So when you start here as an employee, there are times when you can be part of a committee and you begin to learn how the management structure that we have, if you want to call it the management structure, but you figure out how decisions get made. You figure out if there's responsibilities that you'd like to take part in, that you'd like to be part of, decisions that you'd like to have more influence on. And you can sample different parts of the business depending on which committees you put yourself on. So that's kind of how we pull people into not only the ownership culture, but how we expose them to actually how we govern ourselves is by doing it, basically, bring them in.
Okay, thanks. So Chris, and you have two different flavors that you can share with us. So TVF is a 10-year plus mature ESOP, but a lot of these new companies that you're bringing on and you're introducing them to employee ownership for the first time, you still have to go back and kind of revisit that expectation piece from, worker manager. How does it all work out together? So how have you managed that process?
Yeah. So there's a lot of different angles to this. I'll try to be succinct. So I think, the key to begin with is making sure we're consistently educating the team on what it means to be an employee-owned company. I've heard this referred to as the rights and responsibilities of employee ownership. We don't formally refer to it that way, but I think that's a good framework. So it's communicating, you know, what their rights are as an employee owner to information, to having input into, you know, the direction of the company. In our case, not as a democracy, we make that clear because we operate more as a traditional governance model with executives and managers. But we make it very clear to everybody that our hope and intention is to have a highly collaborative culture, a highly empowered culture. And, you know, we communicate that so they know that that's the expectation, that we're kind of creating a public accountability for our management team and our leaders, that all the employees know this is how we want to operate. So anything inconsistent with that ultimately would be at odds with our culture that we're trying to create. In addition, you know, to education and rights and responsibilities, I think that a key for us was to shift and embrace a different kind of manager, recognizing that managers have a different skill set than, you know, high level individual contributors. You know, it's really easy to promote individual contributors into management roles, but if what you're wanting is a management team that really embraces that empowerment that we want individual contributors to have, then, you know, in my experience, you're really looking for different managers than just high-powered individual contributors. So you're looking for people who have kind of a nurturing mindset, you know, an interest in developing people, and are great at looking out for their teams. You know, really walking the walk when it comes to, you know, empowering people. It's not just about a top down, you know, I can talk about the kind of culture we want all the time, but it's really the managers who implement it. So making sure we have the right managers, I think, is the other key.
Yeah, it's really easy, you know, in that perspective, right? That you have an open door policy, you care about what people think and say, yada, yada, whatever, until a deadline shows up. Then it's
Right.
like, you know, shut up, get the stuff done, yada, yada, whatever. And one of the leadership sessions I went to, they were talking about management is like an orange, right? So when pressure comes and you squeeze the orange, right, whatever's on the inside comes out. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good. And again, it gets back to who are we hiring in those roles, and how do we get those guys engaged in terms of, you know, both this is the culture that we want and this is how we expect you to lead in this environment, when maybe, you know, especially like small companies like ours, I mean, we don't have that external training team to be able to make that happen, but yeah, it's something that we really want to encourage and to allow it to be successful, but it's not going to just spring, you know, naturally. So it's really got to be purposeful driven. Yeah. Adam?
I hate to, I'll start to sound like a broken record here shortly, with kind of some of the mistakes we've made. But when Dan sold the company to the employees, I think there was a bit of an understanding gap of how many things that Dan truly kind of had under his control and kind of monitored for the company. And one of them being just kind of the overall strategy of not only the whole company, but each department and how that kind of rolled up into one another. So from the outset of the ESOP, we've tried to promote definitely an open door policy, a new ideas policy. Come to your managers, come to the executive team, anyone with new ideas. Just because we've always done it this way doesn't mean it has to stay that way. But that's easier said than done sometimes. So part of this is we've kind of stepped back as a management team and said, okay, what are the company goals? And we've tried to get those under control first. And then at each manager level, each department level, we've kind of tried to create goals that roll up into the overall company goals. And one of the things that was interesting about that is a couple of our managers, after we kind of went our separate ways from our main managers meeting, they were supposed to go get with their teams and come up with goals. Some of them just created goals on their own without getting the input from the folks on their team. And that was a little shocking, but it's just an example of how that's not really the culture and the mentality that we're going for, especially as an ESOP. So we sent them back and said, you really need to sit with your teams and get everyone's input on this, because that's what this is all about. So when you talk about kind of the delineation between, yeah, sometimes we're going to tell you to put your head down and get the job done. We may have to do that to get to a certain job, or to get a piece of equipment back out on a job site, or whatever the case may be. But we are also going to step back, and there will be times where you can make your voice heard and make sure you are a part of kind of our growth and our strategy moving forward. And it hasn't been perfect, but we are, I think folks are starting to see that that's how we're going to attack this.
Yeah, and I think it gets back to, how is that communicated as well, right? Because if it's just abrupt and, whatever, then all of a sudden, our employees will see actions that don't reflect back to the communications. And then there'll be, that disconnect will foster issues. But if we're open and transparent and, hey, this is why we have to do it this way today, they're going to be a lot more willing to understand and to go forward, and again, to get on the bus, right? Yeah, okay, I understand that we need this piece of equipment to do our next job, and if we don't do that, that's going to negatively impact stock price, so that's not a good thing. So yeah, okay, not a problem, we can go do this.
Yep, I couldn't agree more. And one of the things we've seen that can be most damaging is to get ideas and then not follow up on ones that were not implemented. That is just a killer for that employee ownership mentality. You at least owe the folks, either in that discussion that you're having it, a reason that might not be the best time for that strategy, or why that idea won't work, or at least follow up with them and tell them what you did to look into it and why we didn't decide to pursue it at that time. Because otherwise they just feel like, why am I even offering these ideas when the organization doesn't do anything with them?
Yeah, I float this stuff up and nobody does anything with it. So, it's not worth my time and energy to do that.
Yep.
Yeah, that's not good at all. A lot of the things that we've talked about, one of the questions that came from the group is, all you guys have done something to be able to transition into employee ownership, or have other companies that are doing so. If you had it to do over again, would you have done it? Or, what would you have done differently? And Ole, what do you think?
There's definitely, I mentioned that for us, it started as an experiment. We had no idea that if it was going to be successful. We definitely didn't have a long-term plan, and we should have had a plan for when does the board need to go to a representative democracy and not a direct democracy, or some of the parts of the conference so far talking about valuation and things like that. Our company has never done a valuation. We never plan on selling it. We don't have the stock that we own is based on how much profit we hold back each year. Most of the profit gets distributed to the members rather than getting put into long-term stock. Each member can invest it how they want to, with the restrictions of the IRS. But so there definitely wasn't as good of a long-term plan as what you get with the ESOP structure. Having said that, we do get at the end of the year, if there's profit, if you did a big job and worked on it and put in a lot of hours, you get rewarded for it in the next year, if there's profit on that job. So there's more of an immediate response, I guess. But anyway, so setting up a long-term plan is definitely one of the things that we should have done a better job early on. And it's taken us 30 years to work through some of those issues as we got. So that's definitely, I guess probably the big one is just long-term planning.
Okay, thank you. Chris?
Yeah, as far as the ESOP and employee ownership itself, we wouldn't have done a lot differently. I probably would have brought in some third-party perspective earlier to kind of talk about employee ownership in the wider sense as part of our educational efforts. We did that ourselves in the early years, and it went fine, but I think we would have had more impact getting some additional outside perspective into the company. Kind of less related to employee ownership, but very much related to the entire transition of selling and then becoming, who we are today. I was 32 when, I took over as a leader of the company. And in hindsight, I wish I would have started working with an executive coach right off the bat. There was a lot of opportunity to establish our direction more quickly. I was a little too deferential in the sense that I wanted to show everyone that everyone had a say now. And that was true, but the company needed more direction and kind of clarity around. We had a lot of different factions with different values, and we needed to really pick like the faction that we were going to go with, which set of values are we establishing for our company now? And rather than kind of do that hard work right away, we deferred for a while. And I think that slowed down our progress a little bit. And even, I think that's what I would consider my biggest takeaway is establishing strategy and values very clearly right off the bat is, to me, what has been the biggest unlock for kind of allowing the company to achieve its potential. And we didn't do that in the first 5 years. So I wish I would have done that differently.
Okay, thanks. That's very insightful. Adam?
I believe we probably would have, looking back, we probably would have included all employees into the ESOP. I've mentioned that a few times, but I just think that would have been a cleaner way to do it. And then we could have executed a communication strategy externally that really could have driven home the idea that we're an employee-owned company and the benefits of working with an employee-owned company, or even working for an employee-owned company would have been an ideal strategy. And then I came on board as CFO basically 3 months after the execution of the transaction. If I could do that, I don't know how that would have worked, but I would have loved to work there maybe a year before and during that transaction. And I guess that's just to say that I wish we would have picked and had a champion for the ESOP during that entire process. And then once we rolled it out to the employees, that meeting went great. But we kind of had some canned materials from Principal, who's our TPA, which is where the shares are housed, kind of like your 401k would be housed with somebody like a Principal. And those materials are fine, but I wish we would have done something in addition to that, maybe even some small focus groups or just small meetings. We're small enough that we could have done that to really sit down and say like, okay, we've given you these, our folks got a statement. Some of them were grandfathered into the plan from year one. And just let them ask questions, let them go through any concerns, things like that. We kind of had this big rollout meeting, and then it felt a little bit like, that was it. And then the next time we'll get together is next year when we do the same stock price unveiling meeting. And I think we could have handled that a little bit better.
That's interesting. You inherited the ESOP.
Yes, I got to come on board after the transaction, but before it was announced. So I had like 7 days to kind of read through all the binders of the plans and things like that. So I was in no way prepared.
I'm the new guy, and here's this ESOP thing.
Correct. Yeah.
A lot of the things we've talked about, you guys have touched on, have dealt with the value and necessity of education, of helping the employees understand employee ownership and what an employee ownership or employee ownership behavior is. What are some of the specific things that you've done in terms of educational activities or training? What's worked, what hasn't worked, to be able to kind of bridge that gap between, hey, congratulations. In Ole's case, congratulations. You've been voted in as a worker owner, and not necessarily here's your rights and responsibilities, but here's kind of what that means. Ole?
So there's a couple things. We still don't think we do enough training and education. So a couple times a year, it slowed down a little bit during the COVID years, but a couple times a year we have something we call co-op night, where we invite people in, especially new employees and new members, and they can bring their spouses or significant others in. And we talk about worker co-ops locally, internationally, start giving a history of the whole co-op movement. And then we also do a history of Isthmus and how we got to where we are. And then we'll usually have a second one that talks about how we're structured and how the business works. We've had a couple of our financial people have set up some spreadsheets to show how money flows through the company and how that affects your personal income as you become an owner. Because there's a 5-year buy-in process and a 5-year buy process when you leave the company or retire. So it's taken some time to get there, but we've worked through a lot of the educational elements, I guess, to get people up to speed and enlighten them as to how it all works.
Thank you very much. Chris?
Yeah, I would echo Ole in terms of we don't do enough today still. When we first became employee owned, we started with kind of just an educational session about a lot of the nuts and bolts. And of course, it got very technical very quickly. So we tried to follow that up with, communicating more specifically about individual components of that. So, pick one topic and talk about what it really means. We also we established a communication committee to continue the effort to communicate with everybody and help them understand the ESOP and how it works. That's been mixed, the results of that. It's been a challenge, to be honest. I think we've made the most progress as we focused on kind of educating about how the company financials work. We started doing a quarterly financial review for everybody, pretty high level, but still, talking about how the business makes money and, being transparent about how the business is doing. And then we chipped away at connecting those numbers to their day-to-day and tried to make it clear how they, as an individual, can impact the company's performance. And then we also tried to chip away at connecting the company performance to the actual share price and how we're driving value into their accounts ultimately. So I think we've been largely successful in that sense, but there's still a lot of opportunity on the ESOP side. With our newer companies, we've started a different approach. We are kicking off the relationship by bringing in a third party who does he calls it a "What's in it for me" presentation, and he's quite entertaining. He takes the dry Jim or Rick knows who I'm talking about probably. He takes the material and makes it less dry. He injects some stand-up comedy into the routine, tries to get their attention. And it's just a better start, I think, because it can come across very much like an attorney, speaking about the benefits of this program. And he also brings the added benefit of being able to speak to other stories, other companies, and the outcomes that people have had, rather than just the mechanics of how this very dry, plan works.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things we did was we took $100 bill on an Excel spreadsheet or an Excel thing, and then we said, hey, 50% of our revenue goes to wages, 25% goes to benefits, and then you get all the way to the end, and you've got 10-12%, right, for profit. Because I tell you, a lot of the employees are looking at this thinking, wow, you guys must be making like an 80% margin or something, right? And when they actually see that it's more like 10 or 12%. Again, I think it really drives home the fact that that 1% incremental change that I make, if you multiply that by 100 or 200 people, that's a big difference. And the first time that they see that, their eyes open up, and it's like, wow, okay, this is real, and I can really make a difference here. So I think that's a good tool to use. Adam, how have you guys helped out the employees in terms of education?
So the biggest thing that we've done is the ESOP communication committee as well. And we try to get folks from all across the organization. So we've gotten, somebody from accounting, somebody from estimating, several folks from the shop. And we just bring people from all walks of life into the same room. And we usually do it once a quarter, and we'll have lunch together. And I kind of task them. I've strategically picked folks who I know have an ear around the organization and who talk to folks, and they bring everyone else's questions to the table. And since we're so early on in it, folks are still trying to figure out how this works. They see their statements and they see that they're getting shares and that the price went up, but they don't really understand if that's going to be the way it continues to go. What does this mean? They see some forfeiture shares and they're like, what is this stuff? So honestly, just having them bring the questions, and then I basically have them help me develop the annual ESOP meeting. And we go through the last couple of years, we've gone through the very nuts and bolts of the ESOP and how, there's 50 blocks of shares for our particular plan. And each year we take one of those blocks and that gets allocated to the participants. And then we show that gets scattered into smaller blocks. And so that ESOP communications committee has been far and away the best thing that we've done to kind of help employee education. And then frankly, I still have so much to learn about ESOPs that I just try to be a sponge, and I join, ESOP roundtable groups. There's a conference, a big annual conference next week out in Vegas that I'm going to, and just continuing to try to further my level of education so that when they do come ask questions, it's okay to say, I don't know, and I'll get back to you, but it's a lot better to have the answer right then and there. It just kind of adds a level of comfort for the participants.
Yeah. The other thing we found out was that, much like professional learning or, trying to teach people their job, right? Different employees learn different ways. So if you only have, hey, here's the PowerPoint, go read it, and there's no communication, there's no interaction, you're going to lose people along the way. If it's all, hey, it's one-on-one discussion with somebody, well, you're going to lose people that way. So really, you need to be able to take the same info and be able to present it, in multiple ways, more than once, so that it gets beat into them in terms of, yeah, this is what it is. Yeah, the message doesn't change. The method may change, but it's all the same information, and this is why it's really, really important. And again, the big driver, right, is going to be when they open up that statement and it's something that's tangible to them. Is that 50% of their annual wage? Is it 25% of their annual wage? Let's face it, if you open up that first statement and it's $150, right, that's dinner for you and your wife. So it's like, yeah, okay, whatever. But, when you open it up and it's like half your pay, or wow, this matches my pay, or that one slide that Chris Cooper did this morning, where he showed that, from a comparison to 401k, it's 2 to 3 times your average 401k thing. All of a sudden it's like, wow, this is real. And then all of a sudden it's, wow, I've really got to figure out how can I protect this, because last thing I want is some guru to come in and screw up the project or do a cost overrun or run the forklift into something, and all of a sudden you see those dollars shooting out the window, and that, I think that peer pressure is, as long as it's reasonable, is a positive thing as well to help reinforce it. And with that, we're at 2:30. I don't have any other questions for the group. Anything you guys would like to add just as a closure?
For me, I just put my email in the chat. If anybody has any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out. But thanks for allowing me to participate, Rick, and good luck, everybody.
Thanks. It's been swell having you here. And again, this is the funnest, most exciting part of the conference for me, because it's people that have actually done it, and it's people that have walked the walk. And if it's like, well, gosh, I would never do that again. I mean, those lessons, it's so much better to learn from somebody else's mistake than it is your own. Deb, over to you.